In a world where wealth ruled and love was just a transaction, Ryan Walker, a cold, emotionless millionaire, never imagined that a simple maid's cooking would stir something deeper within him. But Emma wasn't just any maid. She was about to change his heart forever, in ways he never saw coming. A chance at survival. Emma Carter tightened her coat around herself as she stepped off the bus. The sharp winter air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too preoccupied with worries, her mother's hospital bills, the overdue rent, and now the fear that she might lose yet another job. She had been working as a maid and cook in different houses for years, never staying in one place for too long. Some employers were cruel, some indifferent, and others simply replaced her when they found someone younger and cheaper. But she had no other choice. She had a passion for cooking, a dream of becoming a chef. But life had forced her to put that dream on hold. Today she had one last chance. A friend had recommended her for a job in one of the wealthiest homes in the city, the mansion of Ryan Walker, the cold, ruthless billionaire known for his brilliant business mind and equally icy heart. The mansion of a lonely man. As Emma stepped through the towering iron gates, she felt as if she were walking into another world. The estate was massive, marble fountains, carefully trimmed hedges, and a mansion so large it looked like something out of a movie. But despite its grandeur, there was an eerie emptiness to it. Inside, everything was pristine and elegant, yet devoid of warmth. The walls were decorated with expensive art, but none of them told a story. The furniture was luxurious but untouched, as if no one really lived there. The silence felt heavy, suffocating. She followed the house manager, Mrs. Collins, into the kitchen. It was a chef's paradise, state-of-the-art appliances, gleaming countertops, and a pantry stocked with ingredients she had only ever dreamed of using. Yet, for all its perfection, the space felt abandoned. "No one really cooks here," Mrs. Collins said, noticing Emma's awe-struck gaze. "Mr. Walker prefers takeout or dining at his clubs. But he requested a personal cook for a change. Just do your job and stay out of his way." Emma nodded, though she couldn't ignore the odd feeling in her chest. A house so grand, yet no one to fill it with laughter, with love. The ice-cold billionaire. She had only been working for an hour when she finally saw him, Ryan Walker. He walked into the kitchen, tall and commanding, his presence filling the room in an instant. His black tailored suit fit him perfectly, his dark hair neatly styled, and his chiseled jaw was set in its usual unreadable expression. He didn't look at her, not even a glance. Emma felt a strange pull in her chest. She had seen pictures of him in magazines, always accompanied by models or business tycoons, but seeing him in person was different. He wasn't just handsome. He was breathtakingly intense. Like a storm waiting to break, he moved with the confidence of a man who had never been refused anything in his life. Yet there was something about his eyes. Deep, unreadable, but carrying a hint of something missing. "Coffee," he said, his voice cold, void of warmth. Emma quickly prepared it, setting it down on the counter. Their first interaction, a single word, a single moment. But something about him intrigued her. Ryan took the cup without acknowledging her presence and walked out. She exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. What kind of man lived in a mansion like this, surrounded by riches, yet carried such emptiness in his eyes? A meal unlike any other determined to prove her worth, Emma started preparing dinner. She made something simple yet hearty, her late father's special beef stew, a dish that always filled their tiny apartment with warmth and comfort. As she cooked, the rich aroma filled the mansion, drifting into rooms that had long forgotten what home-cooked meals smelled like. That was when it happened. Ryan walked into the dining room expecting silence and cold air as usual. Instead, an unfamiliar scent wrapped around him, warm, nostalgic, and painfully reminiscent of something he hadn't felt in years. He frowned, following the smell into the kitchen, where he saw Emma plating the dish. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her delicate fingers carefully arranged the food, her eyes full of focus. For a brief moment, he just watched. It was unusual for him to notice a staff member, but something about her felt different. The way she moved, the softness in her features, the quiet determination in her eyes. It was as if she belonged in a world far away from his cold, emotionless existence. She finally turned and gasped slightly, surprised to see him there. "Mr. Walker, would you like to have dinner?" she asked, her voice polite but not fearful. Most employees in this house avoided speaking to him unless necessary. Ryan looked at the plate, then at her. He didn't understand why, but for the first time in years, he sat at the dining table. Emma served him, then stepped aside, expecting him to take a few bites and leave, just like he always did. But the moment he tasted it, he froze. The flavors, they were familiar, a forgotten warmth, a memory buried under years of isolation. His mother used to cook like this, before his world turned cold, before he lost faith in love, before he became the man everyone feared. Ryan didn't say a word, but he finished the entire plate. Emma noticed, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something human in his eyes. A silent, wordless beginning. Ryan Walker sat at the long, empty dining table, staring at the now empty plate before him. He didn't understand what just happened. It was just food, just a simple meal. And yet, the taste had pulled him back into a past he had spent years trying to bury. It reminded him of home, of laughter that once filled the halls, of his mother who used to wait for him at the dinner table with a warm smile, before everything changed, before love became a weakness. He set his fork down, his sharp gaze lifting toward the young woman who had cooked for him. Emma Carter stood near the kitchen entrance, wiping her hands nervously on her apron, her hazel eyes watching him cautiously. "Is everything all right, Mr. Walker?" she asked softly. Ryan didn't respond at first. He wasn't sure how to. Instead, he stood up, adjusting his cuffs, his expression back to its usual, unreadable coldness. "Tomorrow," he said, pausing at the doorway. "Make something else." It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't praise. But it was the first time he had acknowledged her existence. And for Emma, it was enough. The ice begins to melt. The next day, she made another dish. Something warm, something comforting. And again, Ryan ate in complete silence, his brows slightly furrowed, as if he was trying to resist some emotion clawing at his chest. Days turned into weeks, and every evening he sat at that same table, eating the meals she cooked. He never complimented her, never said a word about the food. But she noticed small things. He lingered a little longer, his posture relaxed, the tension in his jaw softened. One night, Emma made chicken pot pie, her father's old recipe. She set it in front of Ryan and turned to leave as usual, but this time, "Sit." Emma froze, blinking in surprise. "Sir." Ryan didn't look at her. "Sit. Eat." Her heart pounded. He had never asked her to do that before. The rule was clear. Staff were to stay in the kitchen, never dining with the boss. But something in his voice told her not to refuse. Hesitantly, she sat across from him. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, as he took the first bite. "It's good," he muttered under his breath. Emma's head snapped up. Did she hear that right? He must have noticed her stunned expression because his jaw tightened and he quickly changed the subject. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" She hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before. "My father," she admitted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "He used to cook for my mom and me. He believed food had the power to bring people together, to heal wounds no one could see." Ryan's fork slowed. He didn't respond, but something in his eyes flickered, like he understood exactly what she meant. An unexpected kindness. That night, Emma stayed a little longer than usual cleaning up after dinner. She was reaching for a spice jar on the top shelf when, careful, a strong, warm hand suddenly touched her waist, steadying her before she could slip. Emma's breath hitched as she turned her head. Ryan was right behind her, closer than ever, his hand lingering just a second too long. Their eyes met. For the first time, she saw something in his stormy blue eyes that wasn't coldness. Something raw. Something vulnerable. He let go abruptly, stepping back as if he realized what he had just done. "You should be more careful," he said stiffly before walking out of the kitchen. Emma stood frozen, her pulse racing. That was the first time he had touched her, the first time he had shown concern. And no matter how much she told herself he was just being polite, her heart whispered something else. The night that changed everything. A week later, a storm hit the city. Thunder roared outside as rain lashed against the mansion's windows. The power flickered, and most of the staff had already retired for the night. Emma was just finishing in the kitchen when she heard footsteps. She turned to find Ryan standing in the doorway, his usual suit replaced by a loose white dress shirt, his sleeves rolled up, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked different. Less like a cold billionaire, more like a man weighed down by something unseen. Without a word, he walked to the counter and poured himself a drink. Then, to her surprise, he sat at the small kitchen table, the same one she used for her own meals, instead of the grand dining hall. "You're still here," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "The rain," Emma replied, wiping her hands. "It's heavy tonight." Ryan took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes unreadable. Then, after a moment, he said something that shocked her. "Stay." Emma's breath caught. "What?" "Sit. Talk to me." Her heart pounded. Was this really happening? Cautiously, she took a seat across from him, mirroring the way they had sat at the grand table just days ago. Only this time, the space between them felt smaller, more intimate. Ryan leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Everyone thinks they know who I am," he murmured. "The ruthless CEO, the man who never looks back. But they don't know anything." Emma's fingers curled around the edge of the table. She had never seen him like this before, unguarded, stripped of the cold mask he usually wore. "Then tell me," she whispered. His eyes lifted to hers. The room felt warmer, the storm outside forgotten. For the first time in years, Ryan Walker wanted to talk. And for the first time, Emma Carter was the one he wanted to talk to. The storm outside raged on, but inside the mansion's dimly lit kitchen, a different kind of storm was brewing. Emma sat across from Ryan, the distance between them feeling dangerously small. The golden glow of the pendant light above them cast soft shadows on his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the stormy depth of his blue eyes. He had just asked her to stay. And now he was looking at her like she was the first person in years who truly saw him. "You want me to tell you?" Ryan murmured, his voice low and unreadable. He ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling slowly. "All right. Let's see. Where do I start?" Emma swallowed, waiting. She could tell this wasn't easy for him. Ryan took another sip of his drink, his fingers tightening around the glass as if steadying himself. "My mother used to cook for me." Emma's eyes softened. She wasn't a chef, not even close, but she tried. She believed food meant more than just feeding the stomach. It fed the soul. She would spend hours in the kitchen, making the simplest dishes feel special. His voice grew quieter, distant. "And I loved those moments. I didn't know then that they were temporary." Emma felt something ache in her chest. "What happened?" she whispered. Ryan's jaw clenched, his gaze turning cold again, his natural defense mechanism. "She got sick. And when she died, my father shut himself away. He poured everything into the business, taught me that emotions made a man weak. He didn't care for love. He cared for power, for money." Emma's fingers curled into her lap. She had always wondered what had made Ryan Walker so distant, so untouchable. Now she was beginning to understand. "No wonder you never eat home-cooked meals," she said softly. "It reminds you of her." Ryan's eyes flickered toward her, something unreadable flashing in them. "And yet, every night, I find myself here." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Was he admitting that he kept coming back for her food? Or was it something more? Her lips parted, but before she could say anything, Ryan's gaze dropped to her hands. "You always cook like that," he murmured, almost to himself. "Like it means something." Emma smiled faintly. "Because it does." For a long moment they just stared at each other, the silence between them heavy with something unspoken. The air felt charged, dangerous. And then he reached forward. Slowly, carefully, Ryan's fingers brushed against the back of Emma's hand, testing a boundary neither of them had dared cross before. Emma's breath hitched. His touch was warm, electrifying, sending shivers down her spine. But before she could react, Ryan suddenly pulled away, as if realizing what he had done. His expression hardened, and he stood abruptly. "This was a mistake," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Forget it happened." Emma's chest tightened. "Ryan." But he was already gone, walking out of the kitchen and disappearing into the dark corridors of his mansion. And for the first time, Emma realized something. Ryan Walker wasn't just afraid of emotions, he was terrified of falling. The distance that follows. The next day, everything changed. Ryan avoided her. At breakfast, he barely looked at her when she brought his coffee. During dinner, he ate quickly and left without a word. The warm tension that had been building between them for weeks had turned into a cold wall once again. Emma felt the shift like a knife to the chest. Had she done something wrong? Or was he just running away? Days passed and the silence stretched unbearably. Ryan buried himself in work, spending longer hours at the office. He barely came home, and when he did, he acted like she didn't exist. Emma tried to convince herself that it didn't hurt. But it did, because no matter how hard she tried to fight it, she had started to fall for him. And that was dangerous. A night of vulnerability. A week later, Emma had just finished tidying the kitchen when she heard the front doors open. Ryan was home, but something was wrong. She peeked around the corner and gasped softly. He looked exhausted, his tie undone, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his usual perfect composure cracked at the edges. And he was drunk. Emma's heart clenched. She had never seen him like this. Ryan leaned against the wall for a moment before pushing himself forward, heading toward the staircase. But before he could reach it, he stumbled. Without thinking, Emma rushed to his side, catching his arm. "Ryan?" His body tensed at her touch. His deep blue eyes, clouded with whiskey and exhaustion, locked onto hers. For a second, neither of them moved. Then his fingers curled around her wrist. "I told myself to stay away," he muttered, his voice rough. "But every time I try, I end up here." Emma's lips parted in shock. Ryan's grip tightened slightly, as if he was afraid she would vanish. "I don't know what the hell you've done to me, Emma Carter." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "Ryan!" And then, before she could stop him, he reached up and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was slow, deliberate, intimate. Emma's breath caught. The air between them felt thick, dangerous, electric. "I should go," he murmured. But he didn't move, and neither did she, because in that moment they both knew. This wasn't just about food anymore. This was something deeper, something neither of them were ready to admit. Yet, it was there, undeniable, unstoppable, the beginning of something neither of them could escape. Emma's heart pounded as Ryan's fingers lingered against her cheek, his touch warm and hesitant, as if he was caught between the urge to pull her closer and the fear of crossing a line he could never uncross. His deep blue eyes, clouded with whiskey and emotions he refused to name, searched hers as if looking for an answer to a question neither of them had dared to ask. Emma should have stepped back. She should have let go of his arm, put distance between them before they both did something reckless. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed. The air between them was thick, charged with something dangerously intoxicating. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His name had never sounded like that before. Ryan let out a slow breath, his grip on her wrist tightening slightly. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured. "I shouldn't feel this." Emma swallowed hard, her own emotions warring inside her. "Then why do you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ryan exhaled sharply, looking away for a moment as if struggling with himself. When his gaze met hers again, it was raw, unguarded. "Because you make me feel things I shouldn't," he admitted, his voice low and rough. The confession sent a shiver down Emma's spine. This was dangerous, so dangerous. Yet neither of them moved away. Instead, Ryan did something completely unexpected. He reached for her. Slowly, his fingers traced the curve of her cheek, his touch feather-light, as if memorizing the shape of her face. Emma's breath hitched, her skin burning where he touched. She had never seen him like this, vulnerable, unguarded, completely exposed. And for the first time, she realized something. Ryan Walker, the cold and distant billionaire, wasn't just drawn to her. He was terrified of losing her. A drunken confession. Ryan suddenly let go, taking a step back as if the distance would help him regain control. He ran a frustrated hand through his tousled hair, exhaling deeply. "I need to sleep," he muttered, his voice uneven. Emma nodded, her heart still racing. "I'll help you upstairs." He shook his head. "I don't need help." But when he took a step forward, he stumbled again. Emma instinctively reached out, grabbing his arm before he could fall. "Clearly you do." Ryan let out a soft chuckle, one that sounded almost defeated. For the first time, she saw loneliness in his eyes. Not the kind of loneliness that came from being alone, but the kind that came from never letting anyone in. And something inside her cracked. She guided him up the stairs slowly, her hand firm on his arm. When they reached his bedroom, she helped him sit on the edge of the bed. Ryan leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Then, in a voice so soft she almost missed it, he said, "You smell like cinnamon." Emma froze. He chuckled, his head tilted against the headboard. "Every time you cook, the whole house smells like it. Like home." Emma's throat tightened. Ryan turned his head to look at her, his blue eyes filled with something unreadable. "I haven't felt at home in a long time, Emma." Her chest ached at his words. Before she could say anything, Ryan reached for her hand again. His grip was warm, steady. "Stay," he whispered. Emma's breath caught. "Ryan, I won't do anything," he added, his voice barely above a murmur. "I just don't want to be alone tonight." Emma's heart clenched. She knew this was a bad idea. She knew the logical thing to do was leave, but looking at him now, so broken, so human, she just couldn't. So, against all reason, she nodded. "Okay." She pulled a blanket over him, sitting beside the bed as he closed his eyes. And for the first time in the silence of the night, Ryan Walker fell asleep without nightmares. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The morning after Emma woke up to the soft golden glow of morning sunlight streaming through the windows. For a second, she didn't remember where she was. And then, everything came rushing back. She turned her head, her heart stopping when she saw Ryan was awake, watching her. His blue eyes held no trace of drunken haze, no confusion. He remembered. And the way he was looking at her. It was different, more intense, more real. Emma quickly stood up. I should go make breakfast." Ryan caught her wrist before she could move away. "Emma?" Her breath hitched. She turned back, her pulse racing as she met his gaze. This was it. Something had changed between them, something irreversible. Ryan sat up, his hand still wrapped around hers. "I should apologize," he said slowly. Emma swallowed hard. "For what?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "For wanting you." Her heart stopped. He had admitted it. Ryan Walker, the man who didn't let anyone in, wanted her. Emma felt her chest tighten. "Ryan." He let out a soft, bitter chuckle. "I'm not a good man, Emma. I don't do relationships. I don't even know how to love someone. Emma's throat tightened. Then why are you holding my hand? Ryan went still. For the first time, he had no answer, but his grip didn't loosen. Instead, it tightened, and Emma knew. No matter how much he tried to fight it, Ryan Walker was already falling, and so was she. Emma stood frozen, Ryan's fingers wrapped around her wrist, holding her in place. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver up her spine, and the intensity in his gaze made her pulse race. She should have pulled away. She should have reminded herself that he was her employer, that this was dangerous, that this could never work. But she didn't. Instead, she stared back. Something about the way Ryan was looking at her made it impossible to move. His deep blue eyes, usually guarded, were completely open now. And what she saw inside them, longing, confusion, need, stole her breath away. Ryan's thumb brushed lightly against the inside of her wrist, his touch barely there, but enough to make her entire body burn. "I don't want to let go," he murmured. Emma swallowed, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Then don't." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if something inside him snapped, Ryan pulled her closer. Emma gasped as she stumbled forward, her hands landing against his bare chest. The heat of his skin burned through her fingertips, and she realized with a jolt that he was only wearing a loose white t-shirt, one that did nothing to hide the hard muscles beneath. His breath was warm against her face, his scent, a mixture of expensive cologne and something uniquely him, wrapping around her like a spell. "You don't know what you do to me, Emma," he whispered, his voice rough. Emma's lips parted, her breath uneven. "Then show me." Ryan's eyes darkened, his grip tightening around her wrist. "You don't know what you're asking for." Emma's heart pounded. She knew this was dangerous. She knew Ryan was a man who had never let anyone close to his heart. But she also knew something else. He needed her. And God help her, she needed him too. A kiss that changes everything. Ryan exhaled sharply as if fighting a battle with himself. Then, with a low curse, he closed the distance. His lips brushed against hers, soft, hesitant, as if waiting for her to pull away. But Emma didn't. Instead, she melted into him, her fingers curling against his chest. That was all the encouragement Ryan needed. A deep, almost desperate groan rumbled in his throat as he tilted his head, capturing her lips fully. His kiss was slow at first, testing, exploring, but then it became something more. Something wild, something that neither of them could control. Emma gasped as his arms wrapped around her, pulling her even closer. His hands slid up her back, one tangling in her hair, the other gripping her waist as if anchoring himself to her. She had never been kissed like this before. Like she was the only woman in the world. Like she was something precious. Ryan kissed her as if he was starving, as if he had been waiting for this moment for far too long. And maybe he had. Maybe they both had. Emma's fingers slid up to his shoulders, feeling the way his muscles tensed beneath her touch. She pressed closer, her heart pounding as his lips moved against hers with more urgency. Then suddenly, he pulled away. Emma's eyes fluttered open, her breath shaky. Ryan was staring at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His hands were still on her, his thumb stroking lazy circles against her hip. But there was something in his gaze that made her heart stop. Regret. And then he let her go. The wall between them. Ryan stepped back, running a frustrated hand through his hair. This shouldn't have happened. Emma's stomach twisted. "Why not?" Ryan exhaled sharply, his jaw clenching. "Because I don't do this, Emma. I don't get involved. I don't—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. "You don't what?" Ryan's eyes met hers, tortured, conflicted. "I don't let people in." Emma's heart ached at his words, because she knew this meant something to him. If it hadn't, he wouldn't be fighting it so hard. She took a step closer, her voice soft. "You don't have to push me away, Ryan." His breath hitched, but he didn't move. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. You don't have to be alone anymore. For a moment, she thought he would pull away, but he didn't. Instead, Ryan's grip tightened, and that was when she knew. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Emma stood there, her hand still wrapped in Ryan's, her heart pounding in the silence between them. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the tension in his fingers, as if he wanted to hold on but was afraid to. His confession, his reluctance was still echoing in her mind. I don't let people in. But he had let her in. At least for a moment. Emma squeezed his hand gently. Ryan, you don't have to fight this. His jaw clenched, his blue eyes filled with turmoil. You don't understand, Emma, us. It's not simple. Emma took a deep breath, searching his face. Then make me understand. Ryan let out a frustrated sigh, finally pulling away from her. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the floor like a man trapped between his desires and his demons. I don't do relationships, he said, his voice rough. I don't get attached. Emma swallowed hard. You already are. Ryan stopped mid-step, his eyes snapping to hers. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, in a low, almost pained voice, he admitted, That's what scares me. Emma's heart squeezed. Ryan Walker, one of the most powerful men in the country, was afraid. Not of failure, not of losing money, but of feeling something real. And that was when she understood. Ryan had spent his whole life keeping people at a distance because letting them in meant giving them the power to hurt him. But she wasn't here to hurt him, she was here to love him, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. The distance between them. The next few days were different. Ryan was distant. Colder than before. He still came to the kitchen when Emma cooked, still lingered longer than necessary when she served his coffee in the morning. But the warmth in his eyes, the vulnerability she had seen that night, was gone. It was as if he was forcing himself to forget what had happened. And it hurt. Emma tried not to let it show. She smiled when she needed to, did her work, and acted like everything was normal. But at night, when she was alone in her tiny room, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had kissed her, about the way his hands had held her like she was something precious, and about the way he had let her go. She wanted to scream at him, shake him, make him see that they were meant for each other. But love wasn't something you could force, so instead, she waited, hoping, praying, that one day he would stop running. Jealousy sparks a fire. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything changed. Emma had the weekend off, so she decided to visit the local market. The mansion's chef, Mrs. Harris, had told her about a special spice stall that sold the freshest cinnamon, Ryan's favourite. As she wandered through the colourful stalls, she found herself smiling, something she hadn't done in days. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't hear the deep voice behind her. Emma? She turned, startled, to find Liam Carter standing there. Liam was one of Ryan's business partners. He was handsome in a classic way, tall, broad-shouldered, with warm brown eyes and a charming smile. Unlike Ryan, Liam was easygoing, playful. And right now, he was looking at her like he had just found something he wasn't planning to let go of. I didn't know you came here, he said, stepping closer. Emma smiled. I love the fresh spices here. Liam raised an eyebrow. A woman who knows her way around good food? That's rare these days, Emma chuckled. I wouldn't call it rare, just passionate. Liam grinned. Well, passion is a good thing. There was something in his voice, something flirtatious. Emma felt a blush creeping up her neck. She liked Liam. He was kind, funny, safe. And yet, as he stood there, smiling at her like she was the most interesting person in the world, all she could think about was Ryan. A fire ignites. When Emma returned to the mansion that evening, she didn't expect to find Ryan waiting for her. He stood in the dimly lit hallway, arms crossed, his blue eyes darker than she had ever seen them. For a second, she thought she was imagining things. But then he spoke. Where were you? Emma blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me. Ryan took a step forward, his expression unreadable. I asked where you were. Emma frowned. Why do you care? Ryan's jaw clenched. I don't. I just... He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Never mind. Emma narrowed her eyes. Ryan? He turned away, his hands clenching into fists. I saw you. With Liam. Emma's breath caught. So that was what this was about. She crossed her arms, tilting her head. Are you jealous? Ryan let out a bitter laugh. Jealous? Number, that would mean I... He stopped himself, his jaw tightening. Emma stepped closer. That would mean you feel something for me? Ryan didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Emma's heart pounded. She reached out, placing a hand on his chest. Ryan, if you don't want me with someone else, then tell me. Ryan's breath hitched. For a second, she thought he would walk away again, but instead he grabbed her wrist and pulled her against him. The air between them crackled with tension. You drive me crazy, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Emma swallowed hard. Then stop pushing me away. Ryan exhaled sharply, his hands tightening around her waist. And then he kissed her. But this time it wasn't hesitant. It wasn't gentle. It was fierce, desperate, as if he was claiming her, as if he was finally admitting that she was his. Ryan's lips were firm, demanding, desperate. It wasn't the soft, hesitant kiss of before. This time it was as if he was fighting against himself and losing. Emma melted into him, her fingers clutching at his shirt as his arms wrapped tightly around her, pulling her impossibly close. The world around them disappeared. The only thing that mattered was his touch, his scent, his warmth. Ryan groaned against her lips, his hands roaming down her back as if he needed to memorize every inch of her. But just as suddenly as the kiss had started, he pulled away. Emma's breath was ragged, her heart pounding as she looked up at him. His blue eyes were wild, conflicted. I shouldn't have done that, he muttered. Emma's chest tightened. Then why did you? Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Because you make me feel things I'm not supposed to feel. Emma swallowed hard. And what if I want you to feel them? Ryan took a step back, his jaw clenching. You don't understand, Emma. I'm not... He shook his head. I don't do love. I don't know how. Emma felt a sharp ache in her chest. She had known from the beginning that Ryan Walker was a guarded man. But standing here, watching the pain in his eyes, she realized something. He wasn't pushing her away because he didn't want her. He was pushing her away because he was afraid of wanting her too much. And she wasn't going to let him run this time. Emma reached for his hand. Love isn't something you have to know how to do, Ryan. It's something you feel. And I know you feel it. Ryan stared at her, his breathing uneven. For a moment, she thought he would let his walls down completely. But then, he pulled away. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emma standing there, her heart breaking just a little more. A silent heartache. The next morning, Ryan was gone. Mrs. Harris, the mansion's chef, found Emma in the kitchen and sighed. Mr. Walker left for a business trip, said he'll be gone for a few days. Emma's stomach dropped. He had run away again. She forced a smile. Oh, okay. But inside she felt hollow. Why was he so afraid of loving her? She tried to focus on her work, but everything reminded her of him, the scent of his coffee, the way he always watched her cook, even when he pretended not to, the way her heart ached every time she thought of his lips on hers. It was unbearable, and yet she wasn't ready to give up on him. A surprise visit. 2 days later, Liam Carter showed up at the mansion. Emma was in the garden watering the herbs when she heard his voice. Emma! She turned, surprised to see him standing by the gate. He was dressed in a casual button-down and slacks, his usual playful smile on his lips. What are you doing here? She asked. Liam chuckled. I came to check on you. Last time I saw you, you were looking a little... heartbroken. Emma's breath hitched. Was it that obvious? She forced a small laugh. I'm fine. Liam raised an eyebrow. You don't look fine. Emma sighed, looking away. Liam stepped closer. Is this about Ryan? Her silence was enough of an answer. Liam shook his head, crossing his arms. You know, I don't get that guy. He has a woman like you, smart, beautiful, kind. And instead of worshipping the ground you walk on, he pushes you away? Emma bit her lip. It's not that simple. Liam let out a dry laugh. Emma, love is always simple. People just make it complicated. She didn't know what to say to that. Liam sighed. Look, I don't know what's going on inside his head, but if a man can't see what's right in front of him, maybe he doesn't deserve it. Emma swallowed hard. Did Ryan deserve her? Her heart told her yes, but only if he was willing to fight for her. Ryan's realization. Meanwhile, Ryan sat in his penthouse office, staring out at the New York skyline. He had been in meetings all day, but he hadn't heard a single word anyone had said. All he could think about was her laughter, her smile, the way her lips had felt against his, and the pain in her eyes when he had walked away. He clenched his fists. He had never felt this way about anyone before, never felt this out of control. But the thought of Emma being with someone else, it made his blood boil. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Who is this? A deep voice chuckled. Relax, Walker, it's Liam. Ryan's entire body went tense. Carter. Liam sighed. Look, I don't know what your deal is, but I just thought you should know. I saw Emma today, and if you're not going to step up, maybe someone else will. Ryan's grip tightened on the phone. What the hell are you saying? I'm saying, Liam continued, that a woman like Emma won't wait around forever. Ryan's breath stilled. A strange, possessive rage filled his chest. Emma, with someone else? Over his dead body. Without thinking, he grabbed his car keys and stormed out of the office. He had wasted enough time. It was time to win her back. Ryan's heart pounded as he gripped the steering wheel, his car speeding through the city streets. He needed to see her. He needed to fix this. For days, he had been trying to convince himself that walking away from Emma was the right thing to do, that she deserved someone who could love her the way she deserved, that he wasn't that man. But then Liam's words had shattered all of that. A woman like Emma won't wait around forever. The thought of another man touching her, kissing her, loving her made his blood boil. She wasn't his, but she was. He just needed to stop being a coward and admit it. A silent heartbreak. Emma sat on the balcony, hugging her knees to her chest, staring at the night sky. She had spent the last few days trying to focus on work, on not thinking about him, but it was impossible. Every corner of this house reminded her of him. The way his scent lingered in the hallways. The way he used to watch her from the kitchen doorway, pretending he wasn't interested. The way his lips had felt when he kissed her like she was the only woman in the world. She sighed, forcing back the tears. Maybe Ryan had made his decision. Maybe he truly didn't want her. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to stop hoping. But just as she stood up to walk inside, headlights flashed at the mansion's gate. Her heart stilled. It couldn't be. She moved closer, gripping the railing as she saw a familiar black sports car screech to a stop. Ryan! Her breath hitched as he stepped out, his tall frame tense, his hands clenched into fists. His eyes searched the mansion desperately, as if he had been dying to see her. Their eyes met, and for a moment everything else ceased to exist. Desperation and confessions. Emma hurried down the stairs, her heart pounding so loud she thought he might hear it. By the time she reached the front door, Ryan was already there, out of breath, his blue eyes stormy with emotions. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged. Then, suddenly, Ryan grabbed her by the waist and pulled her into him. Emma gasped, her hands pressing against his chest. Ryan, don't, he murmured, his voice raw. Don't say anything yet. His forehead pressed against hers, his breath warm and unsteady. I tried to stay away, he confessed, his grip on her tightening. I told myself I was protecting you, that I wasn't good enough for you. Emma swallowed hard. And now? Ryan exhaled shakily. And now I don't give a damn. I can't do this without you, Emma. Her heart clenched. Ryan! I don't know how to love, he admitted, his voice breaking. But if there's one person in this world who could teach me, it's you. Emma's breath hitched. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't care. She lifted a hand to cup his face, her thumb brushing against his cheek. You don't have to know how, Ryan, she whispered. You just have to let yourself feel it. Ryan's eyes darkened with something deep, intense, unstoppable, and, before she could say another word, his lips crashed against hers. The kiss that changed everything. It was a kiss full of desperation, hunger, longing. Ryan poured every unspoken word, every hidden feeling into it. His hands traced her back, pulling her closer, as if he never wanted to let go. Emma moaned against his lips, her arms wrapping around his neck as the world disappeared around them. This wasn't just a kiss, this was a promise, a silent vow that he wouldn't run again, that he wanted her, that he was hers. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. Ryan rested his forehead against hers, his hands still gripping her waist. I don't care what happens, he murmured. I don't care how complicated this gets. Just stay. Emma smiled, her heart swelling. I was never going anywhere. Ryan let out a shaky chuckle before kissing her again, softly, reverently, like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. And for the first time in his life, Ryan Walker wasn't afraid of love anymore. The mansion was silent, but inside Ryan's heart, there was a storm raging. For the first time, he wasn't running. For the first time, he wasn't fighting what he felt. Emma was in his arms, her head resting against his chest as they stood in the dimly lit hallway. Neither of them wanted to move, as if breaking this embrace would shatter the fragile new world they had just stepped into. Ryan's fingers brushed against her cheek, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. Her brown eyes were soft, full of trust, a trust he didn't deserve, yet she still gave it to him. I should have told you sooner, he murmured. I should have fought for you before I almost lost you. Emma smiled, her fingers tracing small circles on his chest. You're here now. That's all that matters. Ryan exhaled, as if releasing all the fears that had held him captive for so long. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, slow and gentle, savouring the way she sighed into his touch. She was his now, and he would never let her go. A morning like never before. Emma woke up to the scent of fresh coffee and something warm wrapped around her waist. Her eyes fluttered open and she realised Ryan's arms were still around her. They had fallen asleep on the couch in the lounge, curled up together, their bodies fitting perfectly as if they were made to be this way. Ryan stirred behind her, his breath tickling her neck as he pulled her even closer. Morning, he murmured, his voice husky. Emma smiled, turning in his arms to face him. Morning. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His blue eyes softened as they traced her features, as if memorizing every inch of her. Are you real? He whispered. Or am I dreaming? Emma chuckled, placing a small kiss on his nose. I think you're awake, Mr. Walker. A slow, teasing smirk played on his lips. Then let's make this morning even better. Before she could respond, he rolled her onto her back and kissed her deeply, stealing her breath away. She giggled between kisses, pushing against his chest. Ryan, someone might see us. He groaned but pulled away, resting his forehead against hers. Fine, but I'm not letting you out of my sight today. Emma's heart melted, because for the first time, Ryan wanted to stay. A new beginning. The morning passed in a blur of secret glances and hidden smiles. Emma worked in the kitchen as usual, but this time Ryan was there, not just watching, helping. Mrs. Harris raised an amused eyebrow as Ryan struggled to chop vegetables. Mr. Walker, you do realize we have staff for this, Ryan shrugged, stealing a bite of something Emma had just prepared. I like learning from the best. Emma blushed, shaking her head as she stirred the soup. Flattery won't save you from ruining that salad, Ryan. He leaned in, whispering against her ear. I don't need to impress anyone, except you. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the world around them blurred. This was different. Ryan wasn't just teasing. He was falling. Hard. And so was she. A storm on the horizon, but just as the warmth of their newfound love settled in, a shadow loomed over them. That afternoon, Ryan received a call, his body tensed as he listened, his fingers gripping the phone tightly. Emma, who had been setting the table, immediately noticed his shift in energy. What's wrong? She asked softly. Ryan ended the call and looked at her, his jaw tight. That was my lawyer, Emma frowned. Why would your lawyer be calling? He hesitated, rubbing a hand over his face before finally meeting her gaze. My ex-fiancée, Victoria. She's back. Emma's stomach dropped. Back, she whispered. Ryan nodded, his expression unreadable. And she wants to see me. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Emma's heart clenched, fear creeping into her chest. Had she just found Ryan, only to lose him again? And deep down, a single terrifying question echoed in her mind. Would Ryan still choose her? Emma stood frozen in the kitchen, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Victoria, Ryan's ex-fiancée, the woman he was supposed to marry, the woman he had once loved. She had always known Ryan had a past. But why did she have to return now? Ryan sighed, stepping closer. Emma, She held up a hand, forcing a small smile. It's okay, Ryan. You should go see her. His brows furrowed. I don't want you to think, I know, she interrupted, even though her heart was racing. But this is something you need to face. Ryan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He hated this. He hated seeing the pain flicker in her eyes, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. Finally, he cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing against her cheek. I need you to believe me, he murmured. No one can change what I feel for you. Emma swallowed hard, forcing a nod. I believe you. But as she watched him leave, the uncertainty still gnawed at her. Would Victoria's return change everything? An unexpected encounter. Later that evening, Emma stood in the garden, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She needed a distraction. Cooking had always been her escape, but tonight, even the familiar warmth of the kitchen hadn't been enough to silence the thoughts in her head. Was she foolish to think someone like Ryan could truly love someone like her? As she stared up at the sky, a voice cut through the silence. You must be Emma. Emma turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing by the fountain, was Victoria. She was breathtaking, tall, elegant, and poised in a sleek designer dress, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders like she belonged in a magazine. And she was looking at Emma with an expression that was unreadable. Emma straightened her posture. Yes, and you must be Victoria. Victoria tilted her head, a slow, calculating smile playing on her lips. Ryan never told me you were so beautiful. Emma's stomach twisted. Was this a compliment? Or something else? I didn't expect to meet you like this, Emma admitted, keeping her voice even. Victoria chuckled softly, stepping closer. Neither did I, but I had to see you for myself. Emma's fingers curled into her palms. And? Victoria's gaze swept over her before she smirked. You're not what I expected. Emma raised a brow. What did you expect? Victoria's smile widened, but there was something dangerous in her eyes. Someone easier to break. Ryan's confession. Ryan arrived home to find Emma sitting in the dimly lit lounge, staring into the fireplace. He could tell something was wrong immediately. Emma, he asked, kneeling in front of her. What happened? She hesitated before meeting his gaze. Victoria was here. His body stiffened. What? She wanted to see me. Emma let out a shaky breath. She said she wanted to know who had replaced her. Ryan cursed under his breath. Emma, I'm so sorry. I didn't know she would. She shook her head. Ryan, what does she want from you? Ryan exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. She told me she wants me back. Emma's heart clenched. Ryan quickly took her hands in his. But I told her no. Emma's eyes widened. I told her I've moved on, that I've found something real, someone who makes me feel alive in ways I never thought possible. Tears burned behind Emma's eyes. Ryan, he cupped her face, his blue eyes burning with determination. I love you, Emma. Her breath hitched. 3 words. 3 words she had longed to hear. And now that he had said them, everything else faded away. A tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, I love you too. Ryan groaned, pulling her into a desperate, passionate kiss. It was a kiss that spoke of commitment, devotion, and an unbreakable bond. As he held her close, he vowed, nothing and no one would come between them again. Not even Victoria. The next morning, Emma stood by the window watching the rain trickle down the glass. Ryan's confession still echoed in her heart. He loved her. But deep inside, a fear still lingered. Would Victoria let go so easily? Her question was answered when Mrs. Harris rushed into the room, her face pale. Emma, dear. You need to see this. Emma followed her to the lounge where the television was on. A reporter was speaking. In a shocking turn of events, Victoria Hamilton, the former fiancée of billionaire Ryan Walker, has revealed that the two are planning to reconcile. Sources close to the couple confirm that wedding discussions may be back on the table. Emma felt her breath catch. The screen flashed to Victoria stepping out of a car, looking stunning in a designer outfit. Microphones surrounded her as she smiled and said, Ryan and I have a history. Some things never change. Emma's heart plummeted. Was it true? Had Ryan lied to her? The breaking point. Ryan stormed into the mansion minutes later, his expression dark with rage. Emma, whatever you saw on TV, it's a lie, he said, searching for her. She was standing near the staircase, her arms wrapped around herself. Is it? He stopped in his tracks, his face falling at the hurt in her voice. Victoria is lying, he swore. I rejected her last night. She's doing this to break us apart. Emma bit her lip, her heart warring with her mind. She seemed pretty sure of herself, she whispered. Ryan crossed the distance between them, his hands gripping her shoulders, his voice raw. The only woman I want is you. Emma looked up, searching his eyes. Then prove it. Ryan exhaled sharply, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Right in front of her, he dialed a number. Victoria, he said when she answered. I'm done with you. Don't ever use my name again. A pause. Then Victoria's voice, cold and sharp. You'll regret this, Ryan. No, he said, his gaze locked on Emma. For the first time, I won't. He ended the call and tossed the phone aside. Then, without hesitation, he dropped to one knee. A proposal from the heart. Emma gasped, covering her mouth as Ryan knelt before her. I almost lost you once, he said, his voice thick with emotion, and I won't make that mistake again. Tears welled up in her eyes as he reached for her hand. I don't care about my past. I don't care what the world thinks. You are my future, Emma. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a beautiful ring, simple, elegant, and perfect. Marry me. Emma's breath came in shaky gasps. She had been nothing, a maid, a woman with no status, no wealth. Yet this man, this incredible, complicated, beautiful man, wanted her. She knelt down, cupping his face with both hands. Yes, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ryan let out a shaky laugh before crushing her in his arms. The kiss that followed was filled with love, relief, and an unbreakable promise. They had been through so much, but in the end, love had won. Epilogue. A love written in the stars. A year later, under a sky full of stars, Emma stood at the altar in a breathtaking white gown. Ryan's eyes never left her. When she reached him, he took her hands, his voice full of devotion. I once thought love was a transaction, something to be measured, controlled. But you taught me that love is about the little things. Emma smiled, her heart full. And you taught me that I was always enough. With the ocean as their witness and their friends and family surrounding them, they sealed their love with a kiss. Emma had once been just a maid in his mansion. Now she was the woman who had changed his heart forever. And in each other's arms they found home. They,